The kitchen of Ashford Hall possessed that particular institutional staleness which afflicts the culinary quarters of houses where meals are prepared with competence rather than passion. Copper pots hung in descending order of size. The windows looked out upon a garden gone to seed, and the smell of boiled vegetables lingered in the air like an unwelcome relative at Christmas dinner. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook, no relation to the inspector, though one might have wished for some genetic explanation of their mutual stolidity, sat at the scrubbed wooden table with the air of a woman for whom murder was merely another item on an already exhausting list. She was perhaps 60, with the face of someone who had spent 40 years deciding what other people should eat, which tends to produce a particular species of resigned disapproval toward life in general. "The whiskey," said Whimsy, settling himself into a chair with an ease that suggested he conducted murder investigations in kitchens on a routine basis, "came from where precisely? The decanter in the library, I presume. Or does Dr. Ashford keep a personal supply in his private sanctum?" Mrs. Hartwell's lips compressed into a thin line. "The doctor kept a bottle in the library cabinet. That's his custom of an evening. Whiskey and a book, regular as clockwork. 7:30 after dinner he'd retire to read. I've cleared that glass myself 100 times over, I have." "How very informative," said Whimsy, making no notes, which seemed to unsettle both the cook and the inspector equally. "And who precisely has access to that cabinet? Is it locked? Or do we operate under the charming assumption that no member of the household would stoop to theft?" "It's not locked," admitted Mrs. Hartwell. "The doctor never saw need. His nephew Richard, his daughter Miss Catherine, his sister-in-law Mrs. Ashford. They all know where it is. The servants know, naturally. Anyone in the house could reach it." Whimsy nodded slowly, as though this abundance of suspects constituted a sort of gift. "And the glasses. From where does one obtain a tumbler in this establishment?" "From the cabinet beside the library desk," said Mrs. Hartwell. "There's 6 of them, Crystal, been there since the doctor's father's time. Anyone could take one." "In other words," translated Whimsy, "we have established that any person in this house could have procured both the whiskey and the vessel." "How splendidly democratic. Tell me, Mrs. Hartwell, did Dr. Ashford ever deviate from his schedule?" 7:30, you said? But was this absolute? Never early? Never delayed by correspondence or visitors?" The cook considered this with the seriousness of someone asked to recall the weather of 3 weeks prior. Sometimes he'd be late if he had a patient. Doctor's hours are unpredictable. But yesterday being Monday, he was home by 5 o'clock. I remember because he came to the kitchen looking for aspirin, said his head was troubling him. I gave him some from the medicine cupboard here, and he took them with a glass of water. Then he went to his study. Inspector Hartley, who had been standing with the posture of a man hoping to become invisible, suddenly straightened. "His study? Surely the body was found in the library?" "Aye," said Mrs. Hartwell, "but the study's different. That's where he does his correspondence and accounts and such. The library's where he reads in the evening. He went to the study after taking the aspirin, and I didn't see him after that until Miss Catherine found him." Whimsy leaned back in his chair with an expression of such theatrical consideration that one might have believed he was contemplating the secrets of the universe rather than the movements of A. "Poison doctor. And this study, is it adjacent to the library, or are they separate chambers?" "Connected by a door," said Mrs. Hartwell. "The whole eastern wing on the ground floor is connected, really. Study, library, and then a small drawing room. But they have separate entrances from the hall as well. How terribly convenient," murmured Whimsy. "One might move from one room to another without being observed in the hall. And the door between study and library, is it customarily locked?" Mrs. Hartwell's brow furrowed. "Not that I know of. The doctor liked access between his rooms." Whimsy rose with the fluid grace of a man entirely composed of good breeding and expensive tailoring. "I believe," he said, addressing the inspector rather than the cook, "that we should examine these rooms, particularly the study. I find I have developed a sudden and probably irrational curiosity regarding the doctor's afternoon activities. And Mrs. Hartwell, one final inquiry. The aspirin which you provided to Dr. Ashford yesterday, from which bottle did you take it?" The cook stood and moved to a cupboard beside the stove, withdrawing a small glass bottle with a paper label. "This one," she said. though I could have sworn it was fuller than it is now. Whimsy accepted the bottle with the delicacy one might use when handling a particularly venomous serpent. The label read aspirin, 10 grains, and the contents were approximately half full, perhaps slightly less. He unscrewed the cap and brought the opening to his nose, inhaling with careful deliberation, then passed the bottle to Inspector Hartley with a gentle smile. Aspirin, confirmed Whimsy, contains a certain chemical profile that is quite unmistakable to the educated nose. This smells precisely as aspirin ought to smell, which is to say, not at all like strychnine, which tends toward the bitter almond and metallic notes one assoc. Eates with certain cyanide compounds, though of course this is merely theoretical speculation on my part. I confess I have never actually ingested poison sufficiently recently to make an authoritative comparison. He moved toward the kitchen door, with the casual command of someone accustomed to having his movements followed without question. Shall we proceed to the study? I am beginning to suspect that Dr. Ashford's final afternoon was considerably more eventful than anyone has yet suggested. The study of Dr. Edmund Ashford presented itself as the sort of room one encounters in the homes of methodical men, everything arranged with a precision that suggested the occupant harbored strong opinions regarding the proper placement of objects. A mahogany desk dominated the eastern wall, its surface arranged with the geometric accuracy of a military installation, blotter perfectly aligned, inkwell positioned at precise right angles. A small stack of correspondence weighted down by a marble paperweight in the form of a rather menacing-looking gargoyle. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with medical texts and the occasional volume of philosophy, and the carpet, a faded Turkish rug of considerable age, showed the worn path of someone who had paced this room whilst engaged in thought. The connecting door to the library was indeed unlocked, standing slightly ajar, as though frozen in the moment before closure. And Whimsy proceeded directly to the desk with the purposefulness of a man who knew precisely what he was seeking. "Observe," said Whimsy, gesturing with his customary theatrical precision. "The paperweight. Charming, is it not? Rather garish for most tastes, but there it sits, perfectly centered upon the correspondence. Now tell me, Inspector, in your examination of this room yesterday, and I assume you did examine it given that a murder investigation demands at least the pretense of thoroughness, did you happen to disturb this arrangement?" Hartley consulted his notes with the desperate energy of a man hoping they might suddenly contain information he did not recall recording. "We examined the room, yes. The doctor's correspondence, his banking documents, his personal papers. Nothing appeared amiss. Why do you ask?" "Because," said Whimsy, lifting the paperweight with extreme care, "someone has moved this object. You can see, if you examine the blotter beneath, that the dust pattern indicates it normally sits approximately half an inch to the left of its current position. Moreover, there is a water ring, quite clearly visible to the educated eye, where something previously stood. A glass, I should venture to say, containing most probably a beverage of some description." He set the paperweight down with the gentleness one might reserve for handling unexploded ordnance and proceeded to the leather chair positioned before the desk. The seat bore the impression of recent occupation, and Whimsy settled himself into it with obvious satisfaction, as though attempting to reconstruct the final moments of the room's previous inhabitant. From this vantage point, he could see directly through the open doorway into the library beyond, a vista of bookshelf and reading lamp, and the high back of a wing chair positioned before the fireplace. The question, mused Whimsy, is not how the poison entered the doctor's body, but rather when. The received wisdom, as presented by our energetic Inspector Hartley, suggests that the whiskey glass found in the library was the vehicle. A most reasonable assumption. Except for one trifling difficulty, it depends entirely upon the hypothesis that the poison was administered between 5 and 8 o'clock yesterday evening. But what if, and here I merely indulge in idle speculation, the poison was ingested considerably earlier in the day? He rose and moved to the bookshelf, running a finger along the spines, with the air of a bibliophile consulting rare editions. "Mrs. Hartwell provided the doctor with aspirin at approximately 5 o'clock, she said. Aspirin taken with water. A perfectly innocent transaction, one would imagine, except that our hypothetical poisoner would face a rather tedious difficulty if the poison were administered at that juncture, The doctor might have simply gone about his evening unmolested, might have driven to visit patients or attended to business elsewhere. The poison required precise timing, you see. It required the doctor to be in a specific location, the library, at a specific hour, which suggests either remarkable luck on the poisoner's part or remarkable premeditation. Inspector Hartley's face had assumed the expression of a man watching water boil whilst simultaneously attempting higher mathematics. But the body was found in the library at 8 o'clock, my lord. The timeline seems quite clear. The timeline, corrected Whimsy gently, is precisely what remains unclear. Dr. Wavell estimated death occurred between 5 and 7, based upon the rigidity of the limbs and the current temperature of the body. But such estimates are notoriously unreliable, are they not? Particularly when one considers environmental factors such as the temperature of the room, the rate of digestion, the metabolic peculiarities of the individual in question. A man with a headache, taking aspirin, might behave unpredictably. He might retire earlier than usual, or later, or he might not retire at all. He turned his attention to the connecting door and examined it with elaborate care, noting the hinges, the lock mechanism, the small scratches on the wooden frame that suggested frequent opening and closing. Then he knelt, a gesture that caused Hartley to step forward in alarm, fearing perhaps that the aristocrat had experienced some sort of medical episode, and examined the carpet beneath the threshold. When he rose, there was a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Dust," he said simply, or rather, the absence thereof. "Someone has swept this particular section of floor recently, very recently. You can see where the vacuum has worked, can you not? The carpet nap all pointing in the same direction, whereas elsewhere in the study it lies rather more naturally. Interesting. And what does the library reveal, I wonder?" He passed through the connecting door into the larger room beyond, where the library presented itself in all its cultivated splendor. Floor-to-ceiling bookcases, a fireplace with the ashes of yesterday's fire still visible within, and the wing chair positioned before it where, presumably, Dr. Ashford had spent his final evening. A small occasional table stood beside the chair, upon which rested the glass of half-consumed whiskey that had become the centerpiece of the investigation. Whimsy examined it without touching, tilting his head to observe the amber liquid from various angles, noting the fingerprints visible upon the crystal. "And who, precisely, discovered the body?" asked Whimsy, his voice acquiring that particular note of casual indifference that Hartley had learned to recognize as the prelude to uncomfortable questions. "His daughter, Miss Catherine," replied the inspector. "She came looking for her father at 8 o'clock when he didn't appear for dinner." "Did she?" said Whimsy thoughtfully. "Or did she have some other reason for entering the library at that particular moment?" Miss Catherine Ashford, when summoned from the drawing-room, where she had been engaged in the somewhat theatrical activity of staring out of windows whilst waiting for the police to conclude their investigations, presented herself as a young woman of considerable composure. She was perhaps 24, dark-haired in the fashion that suggested either artistic pretension or genuine artistic inclination, and possessed the peculiar quality of seeming simultaneously present and entirely elsewhere. Her eyes, when they met Whimsy's, contained the wariness of someone accustomed to being questioned by authority figures who rarely listen to answers beyond their first few words. "Miss Ashford," began Whimsy, with the courtesy he extended to all creatures great and small, "I wonder if you might clarify a small detail that has begun to trouble my admittedly pedantic nature. Your father's usual evening routine, as I understand it, involved retiring to the library at 7:30 with his whiskey and his books. A clockwork existence, one might say. Yet yesterday, according to the evidence, something disrupted this orderly progression. Tell me, had your father complained of his headache prior to taking the aspirin, or did the complaint emerge afterward?" Catherine shifted slightly in her chair, her fingers working at the fabric of her sleeve in a gesture of nervous energy she clearly wished to suppress. "He mentioned it at luncheon, actually. He said he'd been troubled all morning with the post. Some letter or other had upset him considerably. He seemed quite out of sorts when he came down to eat." "A letter," repeated Whimsy with the tone of one to whom this revelation was neither surprising nor particularly illuminating. "How very interesting. And this letter, did anyone else observe it? Did he mention its contents, or did your father maintain that characteristically masculine discretion regarding his correspondence? I didn't see it, said Catherine, her voice acquiring a defensive edge. But his secretary, Miss Hargrove, might know something. She handles most of his professional mail. She was in the study with him this morning, typing letters, I believe. Whimsy leaned back in his chair with an air of profound satisfaction, as though Catherine had just provided him with the solution to some particularly vexing crossword puzzle. Ah, a secretary. How exceedingly modern. And is Miss Hargrove a permanent fixture of the household, or does she attend upon a day basis? She comes Mondays through Fridays, said Catherine. 9 o'clock to 4 o'clock. She leaves promptly at 4, as her agreement specifies. Yesterday she would have departed before my father took the aspirin, would have, repeated Whimsy, but did she? One must be precise in these matters. Precision is the enemy of assumption, and assumption, as we all know, has murdered considerably more innocents than any poison could manage. Did you personally observe her departure? Catherine's composure fractured slightly, and Whimsy noted with the satisfaction of a man watching a particularly intricate puzzle begin to reveal its underlying structure, that she had not, in fact, observed anything of the sort. I was out yesterday afternoon, she admitted. I took the motor into the village to visit Mrs. Pemberton, our neighbour. I returned at approximately 5:30, and Miss Hargrove's bicycle was gone from the shed where she keeps it. Her bicycle, mused Whimsy. Not a motor car, then. Curious choice in November weather, but then secretaries are notoriously independent creatures. And when you returned at 5:30, did you immediately come into the house, or did you occupy yourself with some outdoor activity? I came straight in, said Catherine. I put away my things and went to the drawing room to read. That was where I remained until 8 o'clock, when I began to wonder why Father hadn't rung for tea. You were entirely alone in the drawing room? Asked Whimsy. Yes. The servants were occupied with dye, dinner preparations, and Aunt Lucinda was taking her rest. And the drawing room is located where, precisely, in relation to the library and study? Catherine rose and moved to the window, gesturing vaguely toward the exterior wall. The drawing room is directly above the library, on the first floor. The study is below the morning room to the east. They're entirely separate wings, really, connected by corridors. Whimsy stood and consulted the small notebook he had finally begun to carry, though he wrote nothing in it. A gesture that seemed designed purely to make Inspector Hartley feel that some authoritative recording was taking place. One further inquiry, Miss Ashford, and then I shall trouble you no further. Your father's will. Has there been recent discussion regarding its contents? Your cousin Richard, for instance, seems to harbour certain expectations regarding his inheritance. Catherine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Richard is always complaining about something. He believes Father owes him money because Father's brother, Richard's father, died without substantial resources. But Father has already made several gifts to Richard over the years. The argument 2 days ago was about Richard asking for yet another loan which Father refused. And how did your father intend to distribute his estate? Pressed Whimsy, surely you must know something of the matter. Children frequently do, even when parents attempt to maintain discretion. I believe the bulk of the estate goes to me, said Catherine quietly, with a small bequest to Richard and a generous allowance to Aunt Lucinda. But Father was considering revisions. He mentioned it to me last week, said he was dissatisfied with Richard's conduct and was consulting his solicitor about altering the arrangements. Richard, however, has no idea of this. He still believes he's in the will for a substantial sum. Whim. C nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing of his internal calculations. Thank you, Miss Ashford. You have been most illuminating. One final observation, if I may. You seem remarkably composed for someone whose father died under such violent circumstances merely yesterday evening. Most daughters of my acquaintance exhibit at least some symptoms of distress beyond the carefully controlled anxiety you display. Has your relationship with your father been distant, or are you simply possessed of remarkable emotional fortitude? Catherine met his gaze directly, and for the first time Whimsy saw something flicker behind her careful composure. Not guilt, precisely, but something more complex and considerably more troubling. My father, she said slowly, was a difficult man. I respected him, certainly, and I suppose I loved him in the way one loves a parent. But we were not close. He was consumed with his practice, with his research, with his various preoccupations. I learned long ago not to expect warmth from him. Grief, I find, requires some foundation of intimate affection to flourish properly. I have none such foundation to draw upon. Whimsy departed the drawing-room, with this revelation hanging in the air between them like cigarette smoke in a poorly ventilated room, leaving both Catherine and Inspector Hartley uncertain whether they had just witnessed a confession or merely an observation of remarkable candor. Miss Hargrove's residence proved to be a modest cottage situated on the outskirts of the village, the sort of dwelling that announces itself as belonging to someone of respectable but decidedly limited means. Whimsy and Inspector Hartley arrived without warning, a tactical decision that Whimsy had made whilst engaged in the somewhat theatrical activity of examining the doctor's appointment book, which revealed that Miss Hargrove had been employed in the household for precisely 3 years and 2 months. The cottage was painted a cheerless shade of grey, and the garden had been attended to with the mechanical precision of someone who considered horticulture a duty rather than a pleasure. It was approaching 6 o'clock when they knocked upon the door, and the light was already failing in that premature fashion characteristic of English autumn, lending the whole scene an air of Gothic melancholy that Whimsy might have appreciated under less serious circumstances. Miss Hargrove herself opened the door, and Whimsy's first observation was that she possessed exactly the sort of face one might describe as intelligent rather than beautiful, angular, somewhat severe, with grey eyes that held the particular wariness of someone accustomed to scrutiny. She was perhaps 35, dark-haired with streaks of premature grey, and her dress was of that category which suggested professional competence rather than vanity. The drawing-room into which she ushered them was austere to the point of severity: a single armchair, a writing desk, a bookshelf containing what appeared to be medical texts and volumes on psychology, a fireplace containing only cold ashes. "I assume," said Miss Hargrove, settling herself with the composure of someone who had anticipated this visit with the certainty of the guilty, "that you are here regarding Dr. Ashford's death. Inspector Hartley has already made inquiries, but if there are additional questions, I am naturally disposed to answer them." Whimsy settled into the offered chair, with the air of a man making himself comfortable in someone else's territory, a gesture that caused Miss Hargrove's eyes to narrow almost imperceptibly. "I confess," said Whimsy, "that I am less interested in the death itself than in the hours preceding it. Your employment records indicate you were in Dr. Ashford's study yesterday." "Aye, morning, engaging in correspondence of some description. Tell me, was the letter that troubled the doctor yesterday, the one mentioned at luncheon, a professional communication, or did it pertain to more intimate matters?" Miss Hargrove's composure did not crack, but Whimsy observed the slight tightening of her fingers upon her lap. "Dr. Ashford received a considerable volume of mail. I could not possibly recall which specific letter caused him distress. Yet you typed his responses," continued Whimsy with relentless courtesy. "One must assume that if a particular correspondence troubled him sufficiently to mention it at luncheon, it would have elicited some form of dictated response. Did he, for instance, ask you to draft a reply to this troubling letter?" "He asked me to draft several letters," said Miss Hargrove carefully. "Some concerning his practice, some of a personal nature." "Personal correspondence," repeated Whimsy, extracting from his pocket a cigarette case of considerable elegance and offering it to his hostess, who refused with a slight shake of her head. He lit one himself, regarding the smoke with philosophical detachment. "I wonder if you might elaborate upon the nature of these personal matters. Was Dr. Ashford engaged in some form of correspondence that might be described as sensitive, delicate perhaps, the sort of communication that might require absolute discretion?" Miss Hargrove stood abruptly and moved to the window, where she gazed out at the darkening garden with the intensity of someone searching for inspiration in the November gloom. "Dr. Ashford," she said finally, "was considering certain changes to his personal arrangements. He felt that certain relationships in his household had become untenable. He was consulting regarding the possibility of altering his will and was also making inquiries regarding the legal ramifications of separa. Ting from his sister-in-law Mrs. Lucinda Ashford, who had resided with him for some 15 years. These matters, naturally, were entirely confidential. "Ah," said Whimsy softly, "and Mrs. Lucinda, was she aware of these intentions?" "I cannot imagine she was," replied Miss Hargrove, turning to face him. Dr. Ashford was ordinarily quite discreet regarding domestic arrangements. However, he did ask me to prepare a copy of the letter he received yesterday, a communication from his solicitor regarding the will amendments, so that he might review it prior to his appointment next week. That letter was dictated and prepared between 11 and noon yesterday. Whimsy leaned back in his chair, his expression acquiring that particular quality of theatrical amusement that Inspector Hartley had learned to recognize as the prelude to uncomfortable revelations. And did Dr. Ashford seem disturbed by this correspondence? Anxious, perhaps, or merely resolved to effect certain changes he had long contemplated? "He seemed," said Miss Hargrove slowly, "unusually fragile, if I may employ such a term regarding a man of his professional stature, as though he had been carrying a considerable burden and had finally decided to set it down. There was a quality of relief in his voice, if anything, mixed with some degree of apprehension regarding how certain family members might react to the alterations." Whimsy stood and moved toward the bookshelf, examining the titles with the casual interest of a man browsing in a library. "Your education appears to be considerably more extensive than that ordinarily required for secretarial work, Miss Hargrove. I observe volumes on the psychology of motivation, on forensic medicine, on toxicology. Curious reading for someone engaged in the practical business of typing letters and managing files. Would you not agree?" Miss Hargrove's face remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in her bearing, a drawing inward of the shoulders that suggested something fundamental had shifted in the conversation. "I am interested in understanding human behavior, Lord Whimsy. It seems to me that such understanding is essential if one is to navigate the complexities of household management and professional relationships. Dr. Ashford encouraged my intellectual pursuits. He believed that well-read employees performed their duties more conscientiously." "How remarkably enlightened," said Whimsy, selecting a volume at random and opening it to examine the marginalia within. The pages, he noted, contained extensive annotations in a careful hand, underlining passages of particular interest relating to the absorption rates of various substances and their symptoms in cases of acute poisoning. "I find myself wondering, Miss Hargrove, whether your interest in such technical matters might extend beyond the merely academic. Tell me, when you left Dr. Ashford's employment yesterday at 4 o'clock, did you depart entirely from the premises, or did you perhaps remain in the vicinity for some hours longer?" Miss Hargrove's silence stretched across the room like a physical presence, and Whimsy, who had spent considerable years observing the behavior of individuals confronted with uncomfortable truths, noted with interest the precise moment at which her resistance began to crumble. It was not dramatic. There was no collapse into tears, no theatrical confession, but rather a subtle settling, as though she had been holding herself rigid and had finally permitted her muscles to relax into their natural state. She moved to the writing desk and withdrew, with the deliberation of someone performing a ritual of considerable significance, a small leather journal bound in burgundy cloth. "I remained in the village," she said quietly, "ostensibly to visit a free. In fact, I spent the afternoon in the public house, nursing a single drink whilst I attempted to summon the courage to act upon something I had been contemplating for some months. At 5:30, I cycled back toward Ashford Hall. I did not enter the house. I remained in the wood that borders the eastern property, where I could observe the library windows. I was trying to determine whether I possessed sufficient resolve to do what I had decided must be done." "And what precisely had you decided must be done?" asked Whimsy, his voice acquiring that particular quality of gentle firmness that made evasion almost impossible. Miss Hargrove opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon, and Whimsy observed that it contained passages of handwriting that ranged from neat and professional to increasingly erratic and troubled. "I had been in love with Dr. Ashford for approximately 2 years, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "An attachment that was utterly hopeless, utterly foolish, and entirely unreciprocated. I am aware of how pathetic this confession must sound. A woman of my age and education entertaining romantic fantasies regarding an employer of considerably superior standing. But love, as I'm certain you are aware, operates according to its own logic rather than rationality. Inspector Hartley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the expression on his face suggesting that he had wandered into territory considerably more complex than his professional training had prepared him to navigate. Whimsy, by contrast, appeared entirely unsurprised by this revelation, as though he had suspected some such emotional entanglement from the precise moment he had observed the toxicology texts upon Miss Hargrove's shelf. "Continue," said Whimsy, settling back into his chair with the air of a confessor, prepared to hear whatever burden the penitent might wish. "To unload, approximately 6 months ago," continued Miss Hargrove, "Dr. Ashford invited me to remain after hours to discuss certain professional matters. During that conversation, he made certain remarks that I, foolishly, interpreted as indicating a romantic interest. There was a moment when his hand touched mine across the desk, and I allowed myself to believe that perhaps my feelings might be reciprocated. When I returned to work the following day, I discovered that he had entirely forgotten the incident, or, more likely, had never intended any impropriety whatsoever. I had merely projected my own desires onto an act of casual kindness." She paused, her fingers working at the edge of the journal with mechanical intensity. "Over the subsequent months, I observed Dr. Ashford's behavior toward his household. I saw the way he treated his sister-in-law with barely concealed disdain, the manner in which he had neglected his daughter's emotional needs, the coldness with which he conducted his daily life. I realized that he was fundamentally incapable of genuine affection, that my attachment, however passionate, could never be reciprocated by a man who seemed to view human relationships as mere administrative necessities. And then, last week, I became aware that he was consulting regarding the possibility of dismissing me from my position. Miss Catherine inadvertently mentioned that her father felt my services were becoming redundant, that he intended to reduce household expenses." "Ah," said Whimsy thoughtfully, "so you were to be cast off, replaced perhaps by some younger secretary more amenable to the doctor's temperament." "Precisely," said Miss Hargrove, and now there was a quality of bitter satisfaction in her voice. "I was to be removed from his life entirely, discarded as though I were some outmoded piece of furniture, and I realized in that moment that I did not love Dr. Ashford at all. What I loved was the fantasy of Dr. Ashford, the imaginary version of him that existed only in my mind. The actual man was not worthy of love. He was selfish, cruel, and utterly consumed with his own narrow concerns. And I found myself thinking, with absolute clarity, that he deserved to suffer in the manner that he had caused others to suffer. "So you poisoned him," said Whimsy, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact. Miss Hargrove's eyes widened slightly, and she shook her head with surprising vehemence. "No," she said firmly, "I did not. I was in the wood yesterday evening, certainly, and I did observe someone entering the study through the French doors at approximately 6:30. I saw the figure, dressed in dark clothing, moving with familiarity through the room. I assumed it was a member of the household, and felt a curious sense of relief that the decision had been taken from me. I remained there until nearly 7 o'clock, then cycled home, consumed with the cowardly gratitude of someone who has been spared the necessity of acting upon their darkest impulses. When I heard this morning that Dr. Ashford was dead, I realized that someone else had acted upon the rage and despair that I had merely indulged in imagination. And this figure you observed," said Whimsy with sudden intensity, entering through the French doors, "could you discern any identifying characteristics? Gender, height, the color of their hair?" "It was too dark," said Miss Hargrove, "and the figure remained in silhouette. But they moved with a facility that suggested familiarity with the house. They were not large, but neither were they particularly small. Beyond that I cannot say with certainty. I have spent all night since wondering whether I should have contacted the authorities, whether my silence makes me complicit in whatever occurred." Whimsy sank OD and placed the toxicology text carefully back upon its shelf, his expression thoughtful and considerably more troubled than it had been moments earlier. "Thank you, Miss Hargrove," he said quietly. "You have been extraordinarily candid, and I find your testimony remarkably illuminating. Inspector Hartley will, I'm certain, wish to pursue further inquiries regarding your movements, but I find myself increasingly persuaded of your fundamental innocence in this matter. You are guilty of nothing more serious than the universal human weakness of allowing imagination to surpass reality, and for that, no law court in Christendom can properly punish you." The motor journey back to Ashford Hall transpired in near silence, with Inspector Hartley occupying himself with the futile activity of reviewing his notes, whilst Whimsy gazed out at the November landscape with the air of a man engaged in profound internal calculation. Only as they approached the gravel drive did the inspector venture to comment upon the afternoon's revelations, and his observation was characteristically pedestrian. "So Miss Hargrove saw someone entering the study," he said slowly, "but she cannot identify them. We are back where we began, with suspicion attaching itself to anyone within the household who possessed access to the premises." "On the contrary," replied Whimsy. With that particular tone of mild correction, he reserved for those who had grasped only the surface of a considerably more complex situation. "We have narrowed the possibilities considerably. We now know that the poisoner was someone sufficiently familiar with the house to locate the French doors leading to the study, someone small, or at least not conspicuously large, and someone who possessed the knowledge and materials to introduce strychnine into a beverage between 6:30 and 7 o'clock yesterday evening. More importantly, we know that this person was not attempting to remain hidden. They entered through the French doors in what Miss Hargrove described as a manner suggesting familiarity and facility. This was not the furtive approach of a professional poisoner, but rather the deliberate action of someone who belonged within that house. They entered through the front entrance to find the household in that state of anxious suspense which characterizes families awaiting the final pronouncement of investigation. Mrs. Lucinda Ashford, the doctor's sister-in-law, was discovered in the morning room engaged in the therapeutic activity of needlework, a pursuit that Whimsy observed was being executed with considerably more violence than the delicate nature of the embroidery would ordinarily warrant. She was a woman of perhaps 58, handsome in that severe fashion which suggests the possession of considerable will and limited sentimentality. Her face, when she observed Whimsy and the inspector, registered neither surprise nor particular concern, merely a weary resignation suggestive of someone long accustomed to the inconveniences imposed by the living upon the orderly arrangements of her existence. "Lord Whimsy," she said, setting down her needlework with deliberate care, "Inspector Hartley has mentioned your involvement in this distressing business. I confess I fail to comprehend why my brother-in-law's death should require the services of an amateur detective when the circumstances seem quite transparent. My nephew Richard quarrelled with Edmund over money, and Edmund refused to provide additional funds. Richard, in his anger, poisoned his uncle and attempted to conceal the crime. Surely the matter is essentially concluded." Whimsy settled himself opposite her with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in the presence of strong-willed women. "You seem remarkably certain regarding young Richard's guilt, Mrs. Ashford. Might I inquire as to the basis of this conviction? Certainty is such a rare and valuable commodity in murder investigations, and I should be most interested to understand what evidence has persuaded you so thoroughly." Mrs. Lucinda's expression did not alter, but Whimsy observed the precise moment at which her fingers tightened upon the armrest of her chair. "Richard has always been weak and self-indulgent. Edmund carried him financially for years, paying his debts, settling his obligations, indulging his various frivolous pursuits. The boy has no sense of responsibility, no appreciation for the benefits he has received. When Edmund finally took a firm stance regarding this endless financial drain, Richard became abusive. Several servants heard the quarrel. "Heard the quarrel," repeated Whimsy, "but did any of them observe Richard administering poison? Did anyone see him approach his uncle between the hours of 5 and 8 yesterday evening? Or are we, as is so often the case, constructing an entire edifice of guilt upon the foundation of circumstantial motive?" "Edmund was poisoned," said Mrs. Lucinda flatly. "The poison was in the whiskey. Richard had access to the whiskey and to the library. These facts seem rather conclusive." "And yet," said Whimsy, rising and moving toward the window with the air of a man contemplating some philosophical abstraction. "We have discovered that anyone within the household possessed similar access. The servants, Miss Catherine, yourself, Miss Hargrove prior to her departure, and indeed young Richard. The poison could have been administered at any point during the afternoon or early evening, which suggests that the question is not so much who had access to the whiskey, but rather who possessed both the knowledge to obtain strychnine and the motivation to employ it with such lethal precision." He turned to face her directly, and his expression had acquired that particular quality of theatrical gentleness that preceded his most penetrating observations. "Tell me, Mrs. Lucinda, when did you become aware of your brother-in-law's intention to separate from you? Was it this morning when Miss Hargrove mentioned his solicitor's communications, or had you perhaps discovered the letter yourself during some earlier occasion?" Mrs. Lucinda's face underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The careful composure she had maintained fractured briefly, revealing beneath it a quality of desperate rage that she immediately attempted to suppress. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said coldly. "Of course you do," replied Whimsy with that particular courtesy reserved for those caught in transparent falsehoods. "You are a woman of considerable intelligence, Mrs. Lucinda, and you have been residing in this household for 15 years. You must have observed your brother-in-law's deteriorating affection, his increasing impatience with your presence, his comments regarding the burdensome nature of your continued residence. One does not fail to notice such things. The question is not whether you became aware of his intentions, but rather the precise moment at which you decided that awareness must translate into action." He paused, allowing his gaze to rest upon her with the inexorable weight of accumulated observation. "You were taking your rest yesterday afternoon, according to Miss Catherine. But were you truly resting, or were you perhaps occupied with other activities? Searching perhaps for the letter from the solicitor? Examining the study whilst no one was present to observe your movements? And when you discovered that Edmund intended to cast you out, to remove you from the only home you have inhabited for a decade and a half, what was your reaction? Acceptance? Or did you perhaps decide that if Edmund no longer valued your presence, then your presence might as well become permanent in an entirely different fashion?" Mrs. Lucinda Ashford rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone attempting to maintain dignity whilst trapped within circumstances that precluded any such luxury. She moved toward the mantelpiece, where a collection of framed photographs testified to the various stages of her long residence within this household, images of herself and Edmund in younger years, before the particular brand of erosion that time inflicts upon affection had done its corrosive work. She did not look at Whimsy as she spoke, preferring instead to address her remarks to the reflection visible in the mirror above the mantel, as though some other version of herself might offer counsel that her present circumstances did not permit. "You are correct," she said finally, her voice acquiring that particular quality of hollow resignation that accompanies the abandonment of pretense. "I discovered the letter this morning. It had been carelessly left upon Edmund's desk. A communication from Hargreaves, the solicitor, outlining his revised intentions regarding his will and his explicit instruction that arrangements be made for my removal from the household by the 1st of December. 15 years, Lord Whimsy. 15 years of managing this house, of maintaining standards, of enduring Edmund's increasingly bitter nature and his Conte. MPT for anyone who suggested that perhaps his professional success did not entitle him to treat those dependent upon him as though they were mere servants to be dismissed at will. "And yet you did not poison him yesterday," said Whimsy quietly. It was not a question, but rather a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone who had already deduced the truth of the matter. "That discovery occurred this morning, after the poisoning had already transpired. Your rage and despair, whilst entirely comprehensible, arrived too late to constitute motive. Someone else acted before you even knew what had transpired." Mrs. Lucinda's shoulders sagged, and she gripped the mantelpiece with visible effort, as though only the physical contact with solid objects could anchor her to the present moment. "I would have done it," she whispered. "If I had discovered that letter yesterday rather than this morning, I would have acted without hesitation. I had spent the entire afternoon contemplating my future, 15 years of my life reduced to nothing, cast aside like the detritus of an inconvenient existence. I thought of the poison that Edmund kept in his study for his medical experiments. I knew where it was stored. I had access to it. The only thing that prevented me from acting was the simple circumstance of timing. I did not know I was being cast out until it was already too late. Inspector Hartley, who had been standing with the immobility of a man witnessing the collapse of his carefully constructed theory of criminal guilt, finally stirred himself to speak. If neither Miss Hargrove nor Mrs. Ashford poisoned the doctor, then we are back to Richard Ashford as the primary suspect. He quarreled with his uncle. He had financial motivation. He had access to the premises. Richard, interrupted Whimsy, with that particular firmness that suggested further protestation would be, both futile and unwelcome, is precisely what he appears to be, a weak, self-indulgent young man with more debts than character and considerably more rage than wisdom. He would not have possessed the patience to administer poison with such precise calculation. Richard's crimes, such as they are, operate on the principle of immediate gratification. He steals from his uncle because he requires money now. He lies to avoid immediate consequences. He would not conceive of poison as a weapon. He would more likely employ a fireplace poker or a knife, something that would produce immediate and visceral results. He turned back to Mrs. Lucinda, who had collapsed into a chair and was regarding him with the hopeless expression of someone watching the final fragments of comprehension crumble into incomprehensibility. "Tell me, when you discovered this letter this morning, was it in the same position as you had last seen it? Was it open and exposed upon the desktop, or had someone attempted to conceal it?" "It was on his desk," said Mrs. Lucinda slowly, "arranged precisely as Edmund always arranged his correspondence. But his appointment book was in a different position than I remembered it. And there was dust on the blotter where something had been moved." "The paperweight," murmured Whimsy, more to himself than to his companions. "Someone had moved the paperweight yesterday evening, creating the very dust pattern we observed this morning. Someone had searched the study with considerable care, someone who knew that the solicitor's letter was significant enough to require discovery and examination." He paused, his expression acquiring that particular quality of theatrical understanding that preceded his final revelations. "And who, precisely, would have known the precise contents of a communication from the family solicitor? Who would have possessed both the knowledge that such a letter was forthcoming and the desperation to act upon its implications?" Inspector Hartley's face registered incomprehension, but Whimsy was already moving toward the door with the purposefulness of someone whose deductions had suddenly crystallized into absolute certainty. "We must speak with young Richard immediately," he said, "and I believe we shall discover that his movements yesterday evening are considerably less innocent than he has suggested. For Richard, you see, did not poison his uncle out of simple greed. He poisoned him because he had become aware, through means we shall presently discover, that his uncle intended to reduce his inheritance to nothing. And unlike Miss Hargrove, who merely contemplated revenge, and unlike Mrs. Ashford, who lacked the necessary knowledge of her pending dismissal, Richard possessed both motive and the sort of desperate clarity that comes from knowing one's financial ruin is imminent." As they proceeded toward the study where young Richard Ashford had been detained pending further questioning, Whimsy remarked with characteristic irony to Inspector Hartley, "You see, the mistake most investigators make is in assuming that the most obvious motive is necessarily the true one. They observe a quarrel over money and immediately assume that money was the catalyst. But money, Inspector, is merely the language through which deeper despairs express themselves. The true question is never why someone wished their victim dead, but rather why they possessed the specific knowledge and opportunity to act upon that wish at precisely the moment they did." Richard Ashford occupied a small study adjacent to the library with the restless energy of a caged animal, his fingers perpetually engaged in some form of nervous activity, drumming upon the desk, adjusting his collar, or running through his hair with the feverish intensity of someone attempting to impose order upon internal chaos. He was perhaps 26, handsome in that particular fashion which suggests the possession of considerable charm and negligible substance, with eyes that held the peculiar quality of appearing simultaneously defensive and calculating. When Whimsy entered the room, Richard's first instinct was to rise. his second to sit back down, his third to regard the assembled company with the wary expression of a man recognizing that his carefully maintained pretense of innocence had begun to unravel. "Mr. Ashford," began Wimsey, settling himself into a chair with the casual authority of someone conducting business in his own parlor, rather than interrogating a suspect in someone else's study, "I find myself plagued by a small inconsistency regarding your movements yesterday evening. You were, according to your testimony, in your room from 5:30 until 8 o'clock, at which time you emerged to discover the commotion surrounding your uncle's discovery. Yet several members of the household have suggested, entirely without prompting, I might add, that they observed you in the vicinity of the study at approximately 6 o'clock. Care to elaborate upon this discrepancy?" Richard's jaw tightened, and the color drained from his face with such precipitous swiftness that Wimsey wondered briefly whether the young man might be about to experience some form of medical crisis. I may have left my room briefly," he stammered, "to consult some books from the study. There's nothing sinister in that. My uncle's library was open to all members of the family." "The library, certainly," said Wimsey, with studied indifference, "but not necessarily the study. You see, the study and the library are connected by an interior door, but they are also quite separate chambers with distinct entrances from the hall. Now, had you merely wished to consult books, the library would have served your purposes adequately. The fact that you entered the study suggests your purposes were more specific in nature. Perhaps you were searching for something?" Richard stood abruptly, his composure fragmenting entirely as he moved toward the window with the desperate energy of a man seeking escape from circumstances that had begun to close in upon him. "I was looking for the letter," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. "I knew my father had written to my uncle regarding the question of my inheritance. I needed to know what father had said, what arrangements he had made, and I wanted to discover whether Uncle Edmund had responded positively or whether he was intending to deny me even the minimal assistance he had previously provided." "Your father," repeated Wimsey with interest, "died some 7 years ago, I believe. Yet his correspondence with your uncle continued regarding financial matters related to your welfare." "Father made certain requests before his death," said Richard, turning to face them with desperate intensity. "He asked Uncle Edmund to ensure I received the house and a modest inheritance, a matter of perhaps £3,000 annually. Uncle Edmund agreed to these arrangements, but recently he had begun to suggest that perhaps the agreement was no longer valid, that my conduct had become such that father would not have wished his property to pass to someone of my demonstrated character. He was threatening to alter his will, to leave everything to Catherine." Inspector Hartley shifted forward with sudden comprehension. "So you searched the study hoping to discover what communication your father had made, hoping that the original agreement was documented sufficiently to remain binding even after your uncle's death?" "Precisely," said Richard, with the bitter emphasis of someone confessing to a crime less significant than the one of which he stood accused. But I found nothing. The study was empty of any correspondence from my father, and I dared not search too extensively for fear of discovery. I was leaving through the connecting door to the library when I heard the front door open. I assumed it was Catherine returning from her visit to the village, so I quickly made my way upstairs to avoid any awkward questions regarding my presence in the study. "And you observed nothing during your brief occupation of the study?" asked Wimsey. "No one entering through the French doors, for instance? No suspicious activities of any description?" Richard considered this with the air of someone attempting to extract meaning from memories that had been thoroughly contaminated by subsequent events. "The room was cold," he said slowly, "colder than it ordinarily would be at that hour, and the French doors, I noticed they were not quite fully closed, not open precisely, but not latched. I thought perhaps one of the servants had opened them to air the room, though it seemed an odd undertaking given the season." "The French doors," said Wimsey thoughtfully, "were neither locked nor closed, a fact which suggests that someone had recently entered or exited through that particular aperture." "And what time, precisely, did you notice this condition? Was it immediately upon your arrival in the study, or had some minutes elapsed?" "Immediately," said Richard. "I remember thinking it was strange, and I even moved to close them before undertaking my search. But I decided against it, fearing the noise might attract attention from elsewhere in the house. Whimsy stood and walked toward the fireplace, regarding the cold ashes with the air of a man reading tea leaves in search of prophetic significance. "Inspector," he said without turning, "I believe we require a conversation with one additional member of T. household. Miss Catherine, if I'm not mistaken, remains in the drawing room. Would you be so kind as to fetch her? And do ensure that her movements are observed at all times during the journey. I find that people confronted with the imminence of exposure occasionally develop sudden urges toward escape." "Catherine?" said Richard, with the baffled expression of someone watching the fundamental architecture of reality undergo unexpected reconstruction. "But Catherine has nothing to do with this. She was visiting Mrs. Pemberton when Uncle died. She was nowhere near the house. Catherine was absent from the drawing room during a specific period of the afternoon," corrected Whimsy gently. "She returned at 5:30 according to her own testimony. However, one might reasonably question whether her movements between 4 o'clock, when Miss Hargrove departed, and 5:30 were entirely innocent. Did anyone actually observe her in Mrs. Pemberton's cottage? Did any servant note her departure or arrival? Or was there merely the assumption that she had gone where she claimed to have gone?" Catherine Ashford entered the study with the measured composure of someone who had anticipated this moment with the clarity of the damned awaiting execution. She was no longer the carefully controlled young woman who had answered Whimsy's initial inquiries, but rather someone whose emotional reserves had been entirely depleted by the accumulated weight of deception and anticipation. She moved to the chair that Inspector Hartley indicated with the mechanical obedience of an automaton, and when she finally met Whimsy's gaze, there was in her expression a quality of such profound resignation that the detective found himself momentarily assailed by something uncomfortably resembling sympathy. "You did not, in fact, visit Mrs. Pemberton yesterday afternoon," said Whimsy, "not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of established fact. Mrs. Pemberton, when questioned by telephone some hours ago, a precaution I took the liberty of implementing whilst we were occupied with other interviews, confirmed that she had not seen you in more than a week, so we are forced to conclude that your absence from the household was occupied with something considerably more significant than a social call. Shall we dispense with the pretense and allow you to explain precisely where you were between 4 o'clock and 5:30 yesterday afternoon?" Catherine's fingers worked at the fabric of her dress with the same nervous intensity that had characterized Richard's agitation, and for a long moment she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, as though she were confessing not to a crime but to some unspeakable obscenity. "I was in the wood," she said quietly. "The same wood where Miss Hargrove was concealed, observing the house. I had come to a decision regarding my father, you see, a decision that I had been contemplating for some months, but which had acquired a particular urgency following his conversation with me regarding the alterations to his will." "Ah," said Whimsy softly, "so you were aware of his intention to alter the provisions. How precisely did you become cognizant of this impending change?" "Father told me directly," said Catherine, her voice acquiring a hollow quality that suggested she was describing events of surpassing indifference. "He said that Richard's conduct had become insupportable, that he could no longer countenance the provision that Father had made regarding Richard's inheritance. He said that he intended to leave the bulk of his estate to charity, to medical research, specifically, rather than permit it to fall into Richard's hands." He seemed almost elated by this decision, as though the prospect of denying his nephew financial security provided him with considerable satisfaction. Richard made a sound of protest, but Whimsy silenced him with a gesture of such casual authority that the young man subsided immediately. "Continue," said Whimsy to Catherine. "I asked him whether he had consulted a solicitor regarding these arrangements," said Catherine, "and he said that he had written to Hargreaves that very morning, requesting a meeting to discuss the revisions. He showed me the letter he had dictated to Miss Hargrove, a perfectly civil communication asking the solicitor to prepare documentation that would leave me with a modest inheritance, sufficient to maintain myself independently, whilst the remainder of his estate would be devoted to medical research and a small bequest to his sister-in-law. He was satisfied with this arrangement. He seemed almost relieved to have finally made a decision he had been contemplating for years. "And how did this revelation affect you?" asked Whimsy. Catherine's composure fractured entirely, and she pressed her hands against her face as though attempting to physically contain emotions that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. "I realized," she whispered, "that I had spent my entire life as his daughter and received nothing from him but coldness and neglect. My mother died when I was 9. He never remarried. He never permitted me to develop any significant relationships outside the household. He controlled every aspect of my existence with the obsessive precision of a man who viewed family as merely another responsibility to be managed. And now, having finally determined how his estate would be distributed, he had made the decision to ensure that I received enough to live modestly, but not enough to truly escape his influence even in death." "So you decided to escape his influence in a considerably more permanent fashion," said Whimsy gently. "I did. Int poison him," Catherine said fiercely, raising her eyes to meet Whimsy's with sudden intensity. "I went to the wood with that intention, yes. I had procured strychnine from my father's own medical stores. He kept it in the study cabinet, and he had always been careless regarding the inventory of his supplies. I had prepared a solution, and I intended to introduce it into the whiskey decanter, to ensure that whatever he chose to drink would prove lethal. But when I positioned myself in the wood to observe the house, when I saw the windows and the lights beginning to illuminate as evening approached, I found myself unable to act. I could not poison my own father, despite everything he had done to diminish and control my existence. I was a coward, you see. Utterly and completely a coward. And yet someone did poison him," said Whimsy thoughtfully. "Someone entered through the French doors of the study at approximately 6:30 yesterday evening. Someone sufficiently familiar with the house to navigate in the gathering darkness. Someone who possessed either the strychnine you had prepared or access to an identical supply. Tell me, Catherine, when you were in the study yesterday afternoon procuring the poison, did you observe anything of significance? Was the study precisely as you remembered it, or had someone disturbed the arrangement of objects upon your father's desk?" Catherine's eyes widened as comprehension began to dawn upon her features. "There was something," she said slowly. "The paperweight had been moved. It was slightly displaced from its usual position. I remember thinking it was odd. My father was obsessively particular regarding the arrangement of his possessions, but I assumed perhaps one of the servants had disturbed it during cleaning." "Or," said Whimsy, rising and moving toward the window with characteristic purposefulness, "someone else had been searching the study prior to your arrival. Someone who had discovered the letter from the solicitor regarding the alterations to the will, and someone for whom that discovery constituted a motive considerably more compelling than either your own despair or your aunt's rage. Inspector, I believe the time has come for us to examine the movements of one final member of this household, the individual who had perhaps the most to gain from Dr. Ashford's death occurring before the solicitor's letter could be properly acted upon. The servants' quarters occupied a separate wing of Ashford Hall, connected to the main house by a narrow corridor that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual twilight, regardless of external light conditions. It was here that Whimsy found himself, accompanied by the increasingly bewildered Inspector Hartley, approaching the modest chamber occupied by Mr. Jasper Hennings, the doctor's valet of some 8 years' standing. Hennings was a man of perhaps 55, distinguished by the peculiar quality of appearing simultaneously ubiquitous and entirely invisible, the sort of servant who had mastered the art of being present without truly existing in the consciousness of those he served. He occupied himself with the meticulous organization of Dr. Ashford's wardrobe when Whimsy knocked upon his door, and he turned with the carefully neutral expression that years of domestic service had taught him to employ in all circumstances. "Mr. Hennings," said Whimsy, entering without waiting for invitation, "I find myself curious regarding your relationship with Dr. Ashford. You have served him for 8 years, a considerable length of time within which to develop either affection or considerable resentment. Which would you say characterized your feelings toward your employer?" Hennings' composure did not falter, but his hands stilled upon the garment he had been folding with elaborate care. "I served Dr. Ashford with professional competence, sir. My personal feelings regarding his character are irrelevant to the execution of my duties. And yet, continued Whimsy, settling himself upon the edge of the narrow bed with the casual disregard for propriety that characterized his entire approach to domestic spaces, we have discovered that Dr. Ashford was a man whose character inspired considerable emotional responses in those whose lives he touched. Miss Hargrove loved him, and despaired of that love. Mrs. Lucinda Ashford was cast aside after 15 years of service. Catherine suffered beneath his emotional neglect. Richard faced financial ruin through his uncle's caprice. And you, Mr. Hennings, did you perhaps experience some comparable disappointment regarding your position within this household? The valet's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Whimsy observed the moment at which the decision was made to abandon pretense in favor of confession. "I was promised a bequest," said Hennings quietly. 12 years ago, when I first came to serve Dr. Ashford, he informed me that in recognition of my loyalty and discretion, he would provide for me in his will a sum of £500, sufficient to permit me to retire with dignity rather than face the prospect of penurious old age in some workhouse. That promise was implicit in every conversation we subsequently had regarding my continued employment, and this promise, said Whimsy, was never formalized in writing. There was no documented agreement, merely the doctor's verbal assurance. "Precisely," said Hennings, and now his voice had acquired a bitter quality that suggested years of accumulated resentment. "I depended upon that promise, as one depends upon the rising of the sun. I have invested my life in service to this household, foregoing marriage, foregoing the development of any existence outside these walls, because I believed that my loyalty would be recognized and rewarded. And then, approximately 3 months ago, I overheard a conversation between Dr. Ashford and his solicitor regarding the final disposition of his estate. Dr. Ashford was discussing the possibility of entirely eliminating my bequest, stating that he felt servants should be content with mere employment and that gratuitous gifts to domestic staff were excessive indulgence. Inspector Hartley's expression underwent the slow transformation characteristic of a man watching the final piece of a puzzle lock into place. "You discovered the letter from the solicitor," he said, "the communication regarding the revised will. You read it before the doctor even had the opportunity to act upon its contents." "I was preparing his study yesterday afternoon," said Hennings, his voice barely above a whisper. He had left the room momentarily to take a telephone call. The letter had been delivered that morning and was sitting upon his desk, already opened. I read it. I read the precise words in which he described me as someone unworthy of continued financial consideration. I read his instruction to the solicitor to exclude me entirely from the revised provisions, and I realized, in that moment, that every year of my service, every moment of my loyalty, every sacrifice I had made regarding my personal existence had been rendered entirely worthless by a man who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient tool to be discarded when no longer immediately useful. "So you poisoned him," said Whimsy, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of established fact. "I used the strychnine that Miss Catherine had so conveniently prepared and left in the study cabinet," said Hennings with bitter irony. "She had procured it with murder in her heart, but she lacked the courage to act. I, however, possessed considerably more fortitude. I waited until 6:30, when I knew the household would be occupied with dinner preparations. I entered through the French doors that I had unlocked myself months earlier during routine maintenance, ensuring that I would always possess a private means of access to the study should such access ever prove necessary. I introduced the poison into the whiskey decanter, a quantity sufficiently small that it would not be immediately detected by taste but sufficient to prove lethal once consumed. Then I departed the way I had come, and I waited." "You waited," repeated Whimsy thoughtfully, "for your employer to retire to the library at his customary time, knowing that he would consume the poisoned whiskey and that death would come within hours. You calculated, with considerable precision, that the poison would take effect whilst he was alone, that the discovery would occur at evening, and that suspicion would immediately attach itself to those with obvious financial motives. Young Richard with his quarrel regarding inheritance, Catherine with her modest expectations, suddenly enhanced, Mrs. Lucinda with her pending dismissal. "I calculated precisely," said Hennings with the grim satisfaction of a man vindicated in his darkest suspicions. "I anticipated that the police would arrest Richard within hours and that the matter would be concluded without the necessity of extensive investigation. I did not anticipate the involvement of Lord Peter Wimsey, and I did not anticipate the complexity with which the investigation would unfold. But the essential facts remain unaltered. I poisoned Dr. Ashford because he betrayed the implicit contract between us. I gave him my life, and he repaid that gift with contempt and erasure from his will." Wimsey stood slowly, regarding the valet with an expression of such profound melancholy that Hennings felt compelled to look away. "The tragedy," said Wimsey quietly, "is that Dr. Ashford was precisely the sort of man who would have abandoned his promise, regardless of your merits or conduct. His character was fundamentally incapable of genuine gratitude or affection. You have poisoned him not because of any particular failing of your own, but because you made the fundamental mistake of believing that loyalty, once invested, must inevitably be reciprocated. Inspector, I believe the time has come to summon the constabulary for a formal arrest. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style."